Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see all of you or hear from all of you, and certainly hope everybody had a lovely St. Patrick's Day to the best of their abilities in light of the circumstances. And just as always, even if you don't come to Fiveable, you can follow us on Twitter, you can follow us on Instagram, and you can, of course, find us on YouTube. We're here for you. All right, so here's the plan just for today. We're going to talk a little bit about the background. We're going to talk about some of the new states, as this is about the newly independent states. We'll talk about their development. We'll do a practice question. We'll talk about the Cold War, and we'll do a practice working with the document. So it's all practice, no pressure, not graded. So that's just the general look of what we're going to do today. All right. So I'm not going to go over in super detail how decolonization went, because there'll be the other stream that'll go over that. But in general, decolonization was caused by three processes. It was caused by World War II, which had completely drained the resources of the big European powers. So for example, who was the big, someone throw this up in the chat, who was the big European powers that had big colonial empires that were also involved in World War II? Same ones that were involved in World War I. We got Britain for the win, France for the win. Yep, those were the two big ones. You could also throw in, Belgium and the Netherlands, but those ones all had these big colonial territories, and war is expensive. War costs a lot of money, and so by the end of the war, most of these imperial nations were just financially so drained. Most of them, except for Britain, had been occupied by Germany. And so their countries were just kind of in shambles. And a lot of them, even though they would make an effort to try to reassert their authority, sort of had to recognize that they were at the end of their rope in terms of, holding on to a vast empire overseas, kind of end of the line sort of thing. But it wasn't just Europe. In fact, as many of you have probably already studied back in Unit 6, there were active local independence movements of people who just wanted to be free in general. And on the left here, I have a picture of the Indian National Congress, which is just one of the more well-known ones. But there was just a whole slew. Almost every colony had some sort of movement for independence. And so these movements also continued to put pressure throughout the war, after the war, to have their nations granted independence. Some of you might know that Gandhi famously encouraged Indians not to fight in the war, to support Britain, because Britain had not followed up on their pledge for home rule after World War I. And last but not least, you just have a new power dynamic in the world, right? Pre-war, who were the most powerful nations? Well, they're Britain, they're France, they're Nazi Germany, right? After the war, you find yourself in a situation where you actually have two countries that are the most powerful, and both of them are at least explicitly not in favor of colonies. Both of them are explicitly anti-colonial, or in the USA, like quietly anti-colonial, as long as it doesn't impact our allies, but we'll talk about that later. And then you have the Soviet Union, the world's leading communist power that just was, hey, we don't like colonies. We don't believe in colonies, and we'd like you to not have colonies. And so put all this together, and you kind of see a real shift in the attitude towards overseas territory, a real end to this kind of age of empire that had dominated the world for almost 200 years. And so Jed's going to go over that much more in detail in his slides, in his podcast, in his stream. So that'll be tomorrow. You should definitely check that out if you'd like to know more. Here's just a few terms that we're going to talk about. And so if you want to write them down, just in case, we're going to see them again. But these are just terms that you may not already be familiar with. And so I'm just going to put them up here. If you want to take a second, we're going to address each of these individually. But these are terms that are somewhat essential to understanding the development of these new states. So there's villagization, which is the word village, and then verbified to ization. There's the non-aligned movement, also sometimes called the Third World Movement, but we're going to talk more about that. And then there's something called the Aswan High Dam, which you might have already heard about. I know that there are some some freshman social studies classes that talk about the Aswan High Dam. So possibly there's that. So anyways, these are just some must-know vocab, and we'll address each of these in turn. So let's just say that you are, let's hypothetical here. You are the leader of an independent state, right? Newly independent state. Just got your freedom from your colonial power. What challenges might you face? What challenges might you face, right? Think about this question, right? You're the leader of maybe one of these countries in particular, right? What challenges would a leader of a newly independent country face? And so think about that for a second, and then if you have any thoughts on that, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat. But kind of put yourself in their shoes, right? What challenges do former colonies face potentially? And you can think of any of these particular ones, the flags I've thrown up here specifically. Economic problems, dependence on a former mother country. What form of government to enact? That's a good question. Underdevelopment. Ethnic cleavages. Well, that's an interesting way to phrase it, but interesting, all right. Yeah, I think these are all valid points. And there are a lot of challenges, right? Building a nation is not an easy thing. I think the famous revolutionary Che Guevara once said, it's much easier to blow up trains than to make them run on time. So just for some context, in 1900, at the beginning of Unit 7, so in 1900, there were 77 independent nations in the world. By 1975, that number had almost a little bit more than doubled to 145. And then by 1990, with the addition of a number of other small nations, you get up to about 193. And I believe there are 196 recognized nations today. So we really see a jump in the distribution of independent states. As empires end, we see large numbers of new states appearing. And so keep these in mind. These are all very excellent thoughts about challenges of new nations. And so while there were dozens and dozens of new states during this time, we're actually going to focus on 3 here today and the rulers of some of these 3 nations. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Egypt specifically. And so what I've done here is I've thrown up the country, the date of its independence, and then the leader that led it immediately after independence. And so we'll talk a little bit about Egypt. We'll talk a little bit about India. We'll talk a little bit about South Korea, and we'll talk a little bit about Tanzania. Now, funny thing about Tanzania, it actually wasn't called Tanzania. Upon its independence, it was actually called Tanganyika. But there was an island just off the coast of Tanzania called Zanzibar, and Tanzania and Tanganyika and Zanzibar combined and made Tanzania. So a combination of names there. But each of these nations was in a slightly different position, and the path that each state took here are kind of symbolic of the many paths that states could take in their immediately post-independence world. That's why we're going to look at all 4 of these nations in particular. So, awesome. So, just as you guys pointed out, some of the top challenges of a new state would include some of the following. So I think, who was it said? Claire said specifically dependence on former mother countries. And that's one really underappreciated fact about independence, was that it did not automatically mean that you were free economically from your mother country. If you think about it, right, what have these colonies been designed to do? Some of them have been designed to extract resources, right? What do you do with those resources? You ship them to the mother country. So now you're independent and now you're free. What was your entire economic structure based around? Designing, exporting raw resources, maybe finishing small products, right? So you are kind of stuck in the cycle of, wow, the only thing I know how to do is export resources. So I guess I better continue to export resources. And not only that, the infrastructure is still probably owned by foreigners. Even though the colonial master is gone, the owners of those infrastructures are probably from the former colonial country. So there's that. There's also a lack of education, and that was one of the things that colonial powers didn't tend to do unless you were going to run the colony for them, right? Unless you were going to be one of the chosen elites to run the colony, such as the famous civil service in India. Most people did not receive any kind of education, right? Not the kind of education we think of today, where everybody goes to school, learns to read, learns to write, learns to do some basic math, learns some basic social studies, right? That did not exist. And I love this quote from the historian sociologist Walter Rodney when he wrote about the Portuguese in Africa. And he talked about how in Africa, Portugal had been on a 500-year civilizing mission, but in these 500 years, they had not trained a single doctor, right? You've been civilizing Angola and Mozambique for 500 years, but you haven't even educated a single person. How does that stand up? So something to think about, if we think back to one of the reasons why these colonial powers ever came in the first place, there was this rhetoric of civilization, right? This rhetoric of let's get everybody on, let's civilize everybody, let's lift people up, right? But maybe not so in reality. Now, one of the things that I'm sure you talked about, and some of you might have even done this DBQ about train building and empires, or I should say railroad building and empire building, is that yes, imperial powers built infrastructure, such as railroads and ports and harbors, but this was always very strategic, right? Imperial powers didn't build roads to make it easy to go visit your friend in the village next door. They built roads so that you can export the grain or the cotton or whatever resource they might have been extracting from this colony. So infrastructure was strategic. It wasn't just, hey, let's build a train to build a train. It was, let's build a train so we can pull out these resources easier than if we didn't have a train. And so this infrastructure may have existed, but it was strategic and it didn't reach the entire country. And it continued that dependence on the mother country, because if a country lacked the funds to build their own railroads, except via the export of raw materials, then they can't exactly build new railroads to potentially open up new avenues of economic development. So those are the big four, but did I miss anything from what you guys said earlier? Was there something else we could have added on to that? Or are there any questions about that? How to govern. I think you're right. I think you were right about governing. MJ Stevens, hope I'm saying that right. Yes, you're correct, governing. And that kind of goes to that education, right? Who got educated and what sort of, outlook on the world did they have? One thing you'll quickly learn about a lot of these newly independent states was that officially they may have called themselves democracies, but a lot of them were not terribly, they just weren't democratic the way we would think about democracy. Sahil says religion, question mark. By that, do you mean multiple religions in one state or the role of religion? Could you clarify what you mean, Sahil? Oh, like multiple religions in a single state. Yes, I think Ethan also mentioned this, right? Having many ethnic groups in a single state, right, can potentially be problematic. And I think it's an issue going forward. And, having to build nations that are all inclusive and all recognizing of all the major religions or ethnic groups in their states, that's a big challenge. Even to this day, that's a big question. Construction of a formal constitution. Yeah, that would probably, again, go to education. I mean, what you have to remember is most of these places, and especially like in Africa, there were almost no universities in Africa pre-independence. There were a couple in Egypt, but there were, I don't believe, apart from South Africa, and even then it would have been segregated, I don't believe there were any universities constructed in sub-Saharan Africa pre-independence, right? So, if you think about the kind of knowledge you need to build a government, write a constitution, the legal, the scholarly, the historic knowledge you need to build a government. A lot of people simply didn't have that. When the Congo, which at the time was a nation of some 16, or it was some 16, or it was 30 million people, the Congo, that Belgian colony, was huge. When the Belgians decided to just kind of give it independence very suddenly, they had one PhD candidate, or they had 6 PhDs, all of whom had been trained in Europe. And it was basically 6 people to run the entire country because there were no educational institutions, right? It's a huge handicap. It's an often underappreciated handicap for some places. Cool. So how did states try to deal with this? That's a good question. There are a handful of policies that almost all of these states would adopt. Almost all states adopted some sort of combination of the following, whether they did all of them or just some of them. They all did something like the following. One of the big things was almost immediately, if a business was owned by a foreigner, let's say a business was owned by a member of the former colonial elite, typically either right away or maybe a little bit down the road, that business would be taken over by the government, right? And the idea is to try to sever that connection with the former colonial country. Oftentimes, governments would take direct control of major infrastructure projects, right? We need to build a road. How are we going to get the money to do it? Well, the government will borrow money, either borrow money from another country, which happened a lot, or they will, potentially take money from that nationalized business and use it to build that project, right? Now, these were not necessarily profit generating ventures. This wasn't going to make money, but the idea was it needed to be done. And so in order to develop the country, government said, you know what, we need a railroad right here. We're going to build this railroad. And in general, governments try to direct economies. And what is meant by that is governments usually set the priorities. They said, we're going to do this. Right? We are going to focus on this one thing. We're going to build this dam that's going to create electricity, that's going to generate power for our factories, right? This is not what you might call capitalism, right? So the government would take control of many industries, such as, say, the petroleum industry, or agriculture, or cash crop production, if cash crop production is a thing. But they also did one thing that almost every independent state finally did, was to create their own education system, which is really a big, again, it sounds really basic to us today, because again, we have an education system, all of you go to school. But essentially, for the first time, a lot of people learned to read, and this helped to develop a sense of identity. And part of the objective was to kind of overcome some of that, cleavage that you guys were talking about, the ethnic cleaving, the fact that you have multiple ethnic groups in one state, in an effort to build a sense of what it meant to be a Tanzanian or a South Korean or someone from India, right? The idea being that we're going to build a common identity through education. Now, my question for you guys is, have we seen this before, or does this sound just a little familiar? Does this sound like something you have seen before, maybe in a previous unit, right? A government taking control of businesses, directing the economy, building an education system. Sahil says communism. MJ Stevens says Russia. Claire says socialism in Europe. I think communism is an interesting go-to similarity. European countries in the Industrial Revolution. Well, there definitely was some of that. There was some, people forget just how involved the government actually was in the Industrial Revolution, right? Building canals, financing railroads, and an education system. This is true, right? Education only comes about after the beginning of the industrial age. That's correct. If we go even further back to the Mongols, yes, there was definitely some of that, right? Infrastructure. If we think of the Silk Road as infrastructure, right? Directing and constructing and education. So I asked this question because some of this stuff on the surface, right, it does kind of sound a little communistic. So you might see these policies adopted by new states, and you might think, well, do they all just become communist states? And the answer would be no, right? However, they wanted to imitate a lot of what the Soviet Union had done. If you remember the Soviet Union's 5-year plan, right, and about how the Soviet Union had rapidly industrialized and become able to stand on its own, these states wanted to do the same thing, right? They wanted to be able to rapidly stand on their own. And so then these newly independent governments said, you know what, we have to take direct control. We cannot wait, and we need to be like developed right now. It's the only way to stay alive in this world. We have to develop. And if that means taking over businesses, if that means making decisions on who wins and who loses in the economy, then that's what we're going to do. So it wouldn't be incorrect to say, that they were all communist, although some of them, for example, North Korea, Vietnam, and Angola, once it gained its independence, did sort of officially become communist. A lot of states adopted a policy of guided development, what we call a guided development, right? They weren't communist, but they did take measures that seemed rather communist. They did take measures to control their economy. And so one interesting example of that is, for example, the South Korean government protected and promoted the construction, and by the formation, construction isn't the right word there, of large industrial conglomerates. So for example, Hyundai, which is the company in South Korea that makes cars, but also musical instruments. Or Samsung, which is the company in South Korea that makes phones, but Samsung makes a lot more than phones. Does anyone know what else Samsung makes, just out of curiosity, besides phones? Samsung makes a lot of things. They make fridges, they make TVs. And they probably do contribute to the military-industrial complex of South Korea. And so what these corporations were very large, and they were not necessarily profitable, right? But the government of South Korea propped them up because the government of South Korea believed it was critical that these gigantic industrial firms be able to compete on the open market, right? And so even if, for example, say, Hyundai had a really bad year and didn't make a lot of profit, the South Korean government would pay them to keep people employed and to keep producing products that could be sold on the world market. And they still do this to this day. It's kind of why there was that big controversy a couple of years ago in South Korea over the former president being connected to Samsung. So on the other side of this, maybe the not so positive side, or maybe just the outright negative side, was part of that first policy that a lot of states adopted sometimes included the outright expulsion of those populations from their place of origin. And probably the most famous example of this was in the 1970s in several governments in East Africa, most notably Uganda, pretty much just kicked out their entire South Asian population. So you might remember from the age of imperialism that many people from South Asia, what's today India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Maldives, came to East Africa to do work on imperial projects. And a lot of them stayed, and they set up businesses, and they became part of society. But some of these East Asian governments or East African governments, maybe for less than noble reasons, decided that they needed to remove these populations in order to take control of their assets. So nationalizing businesses isn't just taking over businesses. Sometimes it does actually mean kicking out the people that live there. And this is one of the things, you guys talk about building a government, right? A lot of these states, as I said earlier, were not officially democratic. I mean, officially they were democratic, but they did not practice democracy, right? It may have been called the Republic of something or democratic something, but these were usually one-party states, military dictatorships, who, in their drive to develop their countries, didn't really have time for things like democracy, right? Democracy is not important. We have to develop right now. Right? We don't have time for democracy. We can do democracy later, right? Development is what's critical right now. And sometimes that leads to policies like that, right? When one person has way too much power They can do terrible things. So 2 questions. I'm just even. The effects of Stalin's policy on Russia. Yes. Oh, so you mean, okay, so you're referring to the fact that some of those Soviet organizational policies, did they know the outcomes of them on the peasants, maybe in particular? Well, they did definitely know. That's I think what you're asking is, did they know about the negative side effects, right? And the answer is they probably did not know about the negative side effects, right? So if you're asking, did they just know about the Stalin's policies in the Soviet Union, then the answer is yes, because they literally wanted to do the same thing. Maybe they didn't want to have the same negative side effects, but what they wanted to do was become rapidly developed like the Soviet Union had in the 1930s. What you got to remember is, for all the negatives that came with Stalin's policies, the Soviet Union went from essentially a non-industrial country to a completely industrial country in a series of 6 years. So again, good or bad, it's definitely, the numbers look impressive. And so that's part of the reason why they did want to emulate these industrial policies. So I hope that answers your question. All right, so I'm going to take a look at 2 very particular examples. And actually, it's great that Stevens asked that question, because one of the things that Tanzania did was called villagization. So Nyerere, which is Julius Nyerere, was the leader of Tanzania after its independence. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to boost agricultural production. So Tanzania had been a tea exporting nation. They had grown tea, among other things, and exported it to Great Britain. And what he wanted to do was he wanted to use that, grow that tea, and then sell it and use the money to pay for other things, such as hospitals, roads, bridges, schools. And so in an effort to make production get bigger and get bigger production numbers, he did something very similar to what the Soviet Union had done, right? That is to collectivize the work, except they called it villagization, right? So they brought farmers who might have previously been very spread out and working on their own lands together to produce cash crops within these villages for sale, right? Now, it's not exactly the same as the Soviet Union. I don't want to draw too many parallels because the situation was different. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, the farmers who were collectivized had actually owned their own land for a long time, whereas in Tanzania, the land had all been owned by the British government. And so the peasants actually did not own the land, even though they worked on it. And so this was not exactly taking land away from those who owned it, but it was changing around the process of people living in the land. And while this policy did not exceed expectations, right, the other difference is it didn't actually result in starvation. There were no mass famines in Tanzania during this time. So we see that some of the similar results that happen when there are efforts to rapidly develop, right? We see some of the same things, but also some different things. And so another big one is something called the Aswan High Dam, which was built in Egypt. Now, the president of Egypt at the time, was a guy named Nasser, wanted to develop Egypt, and he realized that Egypt would need cheap electricity to develop, right? If we want to build industry, we have to get some electricity, because I mean, how else are we going to pay? How else are we going to have factories and textile mills, and how else are we going to have all this if we don't have a source of power? Right? Egypt doesn't have a lot of coal. Egypt does have some oil, but not a lot. And so the president of Egypt decided, we're going to build a dam on the Nile River, and this dam will generate all the electricity we will ever need. Now, of course, paying for that was kind of a problem, and how he got the money for that is a very interesting story. What NASA did was he simply played each side off of the other. So he asked the United States and Great Britain, he said, hey, I want to build a dam. will you give me some money to do it? And initially, the U.S. and Great Britain said, yeah, sure, we'll give you this money, provided that you do a few very specific things with the dam. And they wanted to have like shares in it. They wanted to kind of run it like the Suez Canal. Something, by the way, Nasser also took over. But Nasser said, actually, I don't think I want to do that. I don't want to like take your money and then have it be under your control. And so then he went to the Soviet Union and said, hey, Soviet Union, will you help me build this dam? And we'll sign a treaty of friendship for forever, supposedly. And the Soviet Union said, yeah, sure. And they gave a much better deal and helped get the dam built. The dam was actually designed at the Moscow Hydrology Institute and was then later built in Egypt. And if you were to go visit Egypt today and you were to go to the dam, there's this gigantic stone tower outside of the dam. And it's the tower to Soviet-Egyptian friendship that was built alongside the dam. So someone asked, did the people working in villagization policy get paid, or did they just get free food? The state paid for their crops. So in villagization, the idea was the villagers produce a certain crop and a certain amount, and the state will pay for those crops, right, at a rate that allows the villagers to subsist. So they did get paid for their crops, for their agriculture. All right. So any questions in general before we do a little bit of practice? Okay. So I have here a multiple choice question, and I'm going to put it up in the polls. Which answer you guys think it is? Let's go ahead and give it a read through. And then you can go ahead and throw it up in the poll which answer you think is correct. It involves these two graphics right here. And if you speak Spanish, if you can read Spanish, then all more power to you. Top one sort of looks like a communist poster. Well, socialist realism was the product of the 1940s. So that's possible. All right. Well, it looks like the votes are in. And it looks like there definitely appears to be a clear winner. So let's go ahead and take each question one at a time. So compare the two posters and consider the ideas they represent. And how are these two ideas similar in the context of the 20th century? So this is a poster from the 1940s. And this references the famous Mexican president, Lázaro Cárdenas. And one thing that he's most famous for was his nationalization of the oil companies that, did their business in Mexico. He famously took over the oil company's facilities and created the Mexican state oil company, Pemex, or Petroleum Mexicano. Right? On the bottom, we have a photo of President Nasser overseeing the construction of the Aswan High Dam. Right? So there's two photos from different time periods and different places, but they both seem to be getting at an idea. And the question is, what is the similarity here in these ideas and the context? So if we just take this one at a time. So did both nations adopt communist ideology? Well, neither Mexico nor Egypt was ever explicitly communist, right? So that one's a no. Both nations adopted an isolationist stance. Well, they may have wanted to free their nations from, outside interference, but neither one officially adopted an isolationist stance. Both nations invited European companies to invest in their economies. May be true in the 19th century. Both Mexico and Egypt in the 1800s did invite Europeans to invest in their economies. Mexico under Porfirio Diaz, and then Egypt under Mehmet, the king, first king of an independent Egypt, or it wasn't Muhammad Ali, first king of an independent Egypt. Both, in those cases, were both invited Europeans to invest in their economies, but that's the 19th century, not the 20th century. And so the answer could be here D, which is that both sought to promote development via nationalization. Right? Both sought to development via nationalization. So as you could sort of argue that Nasser did, I'm assuming you're talking about C. Yeah, so you could argue that Nasser did invite some foreign investment, right? But in that case, Mexico would also have had to have done the same, which they didn't really in the first half of the 20th century. So that's why C would not be the better answer in that case. So you needed to apply to both C and D. You need to apply to both Mexico and Egypt. Cool. Alrighty. So let's talk a little bit about the Cold War. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the Cold War because there are 2 other streams coming up this week that will give you all you need to know about the Cold War. But we're just going to get an overview here. The Cold War in general is a series of events from 1945, the end of World War II, to the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. What do you need to know about the Cold War? Ideological conflict, right? It's a battle of ideas, right? What are those ideas? Capitalism in the American sense of the word, and communism in the Soviet Russian sense of the word, right? But just because it was a battle of ideas doesn't mean it wasn't violent. Very, very violent, right? And what do we mean by an ideological conflict anyways? Well, it was a competition for world leadership, right? Who's going to be the predominant superpower? Who's going to have the most countries on their side, right? The United States or the Soviet Union? Well, how do they get friends and allies on their side, right? They might use military alliances, or they might use international aid. As I've already told you, the Soviet Union did finance the Aswan High Dam. That was part of their effort to get Egypt and the Arab world on their side through the financing of major projects like the Aswan High Dam. USSR, my favorite question, right? Stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? Soviet Russia. Now, what you have to understand is Russia was the largest republic, but there were 14 other Soviet republics in the Soviet Union. Russia just happened to be the biggest and the official language. So it's not uncommon to use the phrase Russia when referring to the Soviet Union. Now, one thing to note, I mentioned this at the very beginning, was that in the context of the Cold War, communism is explicitly anti-colonialism. So during the struggles for independence, the communist states almost unanimously always supported the side fighting for freedom, right? This is a poster from the Czech Republic that reads, "Socialism opens the door to liberation," right? So whenever an issue would come up about, should this colony be independent? The Soviet Union always just said, yes, it should, right? Should this colony be independent? Yes, it should, right? The Soviet Union was one of the first states to recognize many of the new states in the Arab world, and even Israel. It was one of the first states to recognize Israel. So they were very explicitly anti-European colonialism. All right, so that's just a little bit about the Cold War. So as a new leader of a new nation, you have these 2 superpowers in between you, jostling for control. Who do you choose? Which side do you join, right? Do you even have to pick a side? I don't know. Maybe you don't. One of the things about this time, when it came to newly independent nations, is who did you join, right? Did you join the United States and their allies? Or did you join the Soviet Union and their allies? And probably a really good example of this would be the Koreas, right? To this day, South Korea remains an excellent ally of the United States, right? We have somewhere in the range of 30,000 troops there. And up until the end of the Cold War, North Korea was a staunch Soviet ally, right? And they still maintain good relations with Russia, although there's no more Soviet Union, right? Or you could go the way of the non-aligned movement, right? This was an explicit movement of nations who did not want to be part of one side or the other, right? Now, maybe they kind of flirted with one side or the other, but they officially did not want to join one bloc or the other. Probably the most well-known of these nations would be India under Nehru, the first president of India post-independence, who most famously did all he could to not get India entangled in one side or the other, right? Rejecting both Soviet efforts to court him to the Soviet side and rejecting American efforts to court him over to the American side, right? tried to steer India down a non-aligned path. And so the non-aligned movement is one way. People sometimes talk about the Cold War like you have the two worlds, right? You have the Soviet Union in the second world, and you have the USA as the first world, right? But there is, in fact, a third world. And I know we normally hear that word, and what do we normally associate it with? You hear this word third world, and what pops into your mind? Sahil says poor countries, right? We think underdeveloped. We think, poverty, right? But third world originally just meant nations that were not about to be pulled into one side or the other, right? The non-aligned movement was sometimes even called the third world movement because they were not about to get involved in this, right? And one of the most interesting examples of this, probably the thing that gives birth to the third world movement, is something called the Bandung Conference in 1955. It's a conference of 29 nations. It's held in Bandung, Indonesia, right? Almost all of these nations were newly independent nations. And together, these 29 nations at the time represented 54% of the world's population. Today, they would represent a little bit more than that. I think they might represent like 60% of the world's population, right? And so this was a major meeting, right? And these were all these leaders, some of whom were a little bit aligned to the United States, or some were a little bit of aligned to the Soviet Union. But in general, these nations were nations that sought not to get involved with this developing Cold War. And so these nations put out a 10-part plan, right, for what they wanted as nations who represented literally half of the world. And you can summarize them sort of down to three main points, which is that they wanted a strict observation of the United Nations Charter, right? They wanted all the things that were outlined in the United Nations: no war, no annexation of territory. They wanted all of these things to be observed, not just by them, but by the Soviet Union and the United States, right? And at the time, 1955, only about half of the countries in Africa had been decolonized. And so they were demanding a formal end to colonialism everywhere. And they said, all right, we're free. We would like the rest of the world to be free. So please kind of let us out. And they also demanded a recognition of racial equality. They demanded an end to this perception that somehow certain races were inferior and other races were superior, right? And this conference is sort of seen as the birth of the non-aligned movement, or the birth of the third world movement, right? You can argue it goes back a lot further, but we'll stick with the Bandung Conference, right? Most of the nations who would later not be aligned to one power or the other did attend. In this picture down here in the corner, you have the prime minister, you have the president of Nehru, you have Nasser of Egypt, of Kenya, and you have this guy named Sukarno of Indonesia. Even though Indonesia would later formally align with the US, at the time, it was one of the staunchest advocates of non-alignment, seeing as it had just won its independence from the Dutch. Let's see, Sahil, I think, asked a question. Got another question really quick. What is the United Nations Charter? So if you haven't gotten to the end of World War II in your class, that might be an unknown. But the United Nations Charter was the founding document of the United Nations. And there was a lot in it, but essentially it advocated the premise of peace over violence. That was one of its primary objectives, right? We're going to make sure that we don't have wars of aggression and wars of attrition, and we're going to live peacefully with each other. So that's one of the emphases of the United Nations Charter. And so the nations of the third world demanded an observation of this charter. So just to give you an idea, here's a map, right? This is 1975, so this would have been about 20 years after the conference. By 1975, most of the nations of the world were independent at this point. But here you can kind of see a division of the world into first, second, and third worlds, right? And so blue is the first world, that is the second world, and is the third world. So looking at this map, Sahil asked a good question, but I would like you to think about as well. Why would newly independent nations be so hesitant to join one of these alliances, right? I mean, I would think the Soviet Union and the United States would have a lot to offer a nation, right? Potential economic aid, maybe even military aid, right? Why would these nations be so hesitant to join, right? Why wouldn't you want to join a super alliance? A question. He asked, did these people at the conference not want to potentially be in a war because they didn't have the resources to fight, right? And that's something to think about. These nations were newly independent. They had just come out of, being under colonial domination for potentially up to 500 years, right? Maybe they didn't want to get drawn into a proxy conflict. War is expensive. Thomas says maybe they're unprepared to put themselves on a global scale. Maybe it's a possibility. Claire says they didn't want to put themselves under the dependence of another country. Yeah, I mean, that could also be. I mean, you just got out of being in a permanent alliance with another nation, right? Unbreaked with another nation. Maybe they wouldn't want to do that again, right? So I think those are all excellent thoughts. And it's with those thoughts in mind that I'd like us to go on to our last part that we're going to do today. But before we get to this document practice, are there any questions in general? Okay, so real quick, last thing we're going to do here. Go ahead and take a few minutes and just read this. And then try your hand at maybe answering A or B below. So take a minute, and I'll take a look in here and see if there's any questions I have not answered yet. Was China still classified as a third world country by 1975? Do you mean, if you mean politically, was China still a third world country? The answer would be no, because China had at that point, China had joined an alliance with the Soviet Union and then later broken that alliance with the Soviet Union. But by that time, China had its own allies, and China was spreading sort of its own form of communism at that time. There's a couple of actually very interesting examples of Maoist, called Maoist, which is like a Chinese version of communist movements in South Asia as well as South America, most famously the Shining Path in South America. So politically, no, China would not have been a third world country by 1975. Economically, if we're talking about our traditional definitions of underdevelopment, just depends. I mean, China today, as in China 2020, did not start to appear until around the mid-90s. So in terms of GDP, and I don't know this off the top of my head, you can look it up, but GDP-wise, China was probably, on par with countries in parts of Africa and South America in 1975. But you know what? That's a good question. We should look that up. China's GDP 1975. Interesting. So just for comparison, this is a great question. By 1975, China's GDP was 160 million, 160 billion. But for comparison, Japan's GDP at the exact same time was $1 trillion. So at the time, Japan was beating China by about a factor of 2 to 1. Or not 2 to 1, like 7 to 1. Of course, that was 1975. A lot has happened since 1975. Akshay had a question. Was the USSR a union of communist peoples in Central Europe or a union of Slavic peoples? USSR is a union of communist governments, not all of whom were Slavic. So it was 14 communist governments that signed a treaty in 1922 saying that they were going to be in a united government. And so that's what the USSR is. It's dominated by Russia, but it includes parts of Eastern Europe, parts of Central Asia. All right. So let's see. How did Japan's GDP get so high relative? Okay. All right. Yeah. Let's go ahead and we're running low on time, so let's go ahead and take a look. A few things that jumped at me, just because we should always practice annotating when we read these. A few things that jump out at me would be the references to the we, and who is the we seems to be the people of Africa and Asia, right? But also mentions of the rest of the human population, the minority of the world, which lives on the other continents. We used to be talking about America and Europe mostly, although we could also be talking about South America. Also talking about peace. So, context-wise, if you got a question like this, context could be any of the following points, right? The age of decolonization, right? The Cold War. You could also, if you really want to get specific, you could talk about the Korean War, which had just ended about 2 years prior. So the conference is in 1955, Korean War ends in 1953. So if you wanted to talk about maybe all this talk about peace is connected potentially to a recent conflict in Korea, perhaps. So intended audience, the fun one, the intended audience. So I see a couple in chat, but intended audience would be the attendees, the USA and the USSR. Attendees, shown by the number of times he said we. Well, attendees would be sort of a direct answer, because I'm always telling students it's usually more than meets the eye. So yes, you could make the case that the attendees are the literal people sitting in the audience listening to the speech. But outside of that, right, who might be the attendees? So Yang King, I think, if that's how you say it, says maybe the USA and the USSR. Claire says maybe the citizens of African and Asian countries. I think those are all excellent possible answers, right? And so, here are a couple of possible answers, right? You could talk about how this is directed at people still under colonial rule, right? And that's because at this time, 1955, again, like for just comparison, only half of Africa had gained independence at this point, right? And so maybe this is directed at those who are still under colonial rule as a source of inspiration, maybe, or maybe a nonviolence call, possibly. Maybe directed at former and still existing colonial powers, right? Maybe it was sort of a flex, if you will. Right? You cannot intimidate the nations of Asia and Africa. Right? If your domination is over, could be that. Might also be those other powers, right? Aligned with the USA or with the USSR, right? Maybe those nations like South Korea aligned with the USA or aligned with the USSR, right? Those nations who were newly independent but had chosen a side, right? Calling on those nations to break their alliance and be a source of peace, not conflict, right? The document seems to talk a lot about peace, right? A lot about not starting conflict, so maybe that was that. Maybe that was Any other ones? Any other ones that you think you think you could put up there? So I'll quick run back over these. So part B talked about, part B was talking about current and former colonial powers, because remember, this is 1955. This is not the end of decolonization. And maybe this is also talking about those nations that are aligned with the USSR or the USA. Lagging. Lag is not our friend here. Anywho, that's all I've got for you today. So if you want me to stick around and re-explain this in case you missed it, I'll be happy to do that. But if not, that Unit 7 8 choice practice stream should be starting relatively soon, so I don't want to keep you from that. So I'll let you go ahead and run on to that. But yeah, these slides will be available. I'll upload them with the restream. And even if this stream in particular has lagged, you can go ahead and when I upload the video, it won't lag. So anywho, alrighty. Well, thank you all so much for coming out. And I hope that this gave you a little bit of insight into the directions and the objectives and the movements of the newly decolonized states. And everybody stay healthy, stay safe, get sleep, lots of sleep. Nisa asks, how did the First World War affect French territories? What an oddly specific question. How did the First World War affect French territories? Probably by drafting colonial soldiers and giving them a sense of agency that they previously not experienced under colonialism. That would probably be a good answer to that question. Okay, all righty. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.